first objective. The second objective is to show the manifestation of Cold War, how that Cold War was implemented. And the third is to examine the reasons for detente between the two conflicting blocs. Detente, we're going to see it in detail, but it means the collapse or the reduction of Cold War. What were the factors for the reduction or the ending of Cold War? Sometimes called detente, sometimes we call it thaw. So we are going to see about it in detail, my dear students. And let's now go to the first part of our lesson of today, which is the Cold War. The Cold War. Let's first see, what does a word Cold War stands for? A word Cold War was introduced in 1945. In fact, it was in October. It was October 19th in 1945. This word was introduced by a man called George Orwell. George Orwell introduced this word Cold War after he wrote his article, which is called "You and the Atomic Bomb," and that article was written in the newspaper, the newspaper which was called the Tribune of London. So he wrote his article and he introduced this word Cold War. And the word Cold War ever since was used in the world to refer to misunderstanding, tension, and conflict that existed between the Eastern Bloc, and the Western Bloc. Eastern Bloc and Western Bloc. By Eastern Bloc, we are referring to those countries which used to be guided by USSR, and by the Western Bloc, we are referring to those countries which were under USA. And this led to a very high misunderstanding, tension, and conflict. So, my dear students, what you have to know is, by Cold War, there is no war. It's the absence of war. But there is absence of war between two countries, between USA and the USSR. But other countries are fighting. The third parties are fighting, either among themselves or between USA and those countries, or USSR and those countries. So other countries are at war, but Cold War, meaning the absence of war, it is only between USA and USSR. So in short, what I want you to know about this term Cold War is that we are talking about misunderstanding. We are talking about conflict. We are talking about suspicion between these countries. There is no trusting each other, among these countries. This is what we refer to as Cold War. My dear students, let's look Cold War at a very low level. Let's take Cold War at a family level. Just look at the schools where you have got some friends, you have got some fellow students. Sometimes some students, they are not talking to each other because of some reasons. They are not speaking each other. They are not, they are not asking questions each other. They are not conducting discussion each other. Why? Because of some sort of conflict or misunderstanding or suspicious, or tension among them, and so on. But under Cold War, remember, these people are not fighting. These people are not fighting. So that is the way we can understand Cold War. So sometimes you don't greet each other, you don't talk to each other, you don't help each other. That's what we mean by Cold War. So you can look it at school. You can look at our home. Our home. Sometimes people are not speaking each other in the neighborhood where they live. Also, in the village. Even at the national level, some leaders probably, they are not talking to each other. That's the way we can understand Cold War. But one thing you have to know, my dear students, is under Cold War situation, there is no what we call the armed conflict. There is no physical confrontation. What is there under Cold War is that there is all suspicion, there is misunderstanding, there is conflict, and there is tension between people. That's exactly what we mean by a word Cold War. My dear students, here we have got some guiding question, and it's my hope that at the end of our study of this topic of Cold War, you'll be able to attempt these two questions. The first question is, analyze the key issues which escalated the tension between the Eastern Bloc and the Western Bloc up to 1980s. The second is, it was easy to reveal the existence of Cold War between Eastern Bloc and Western Bloc. Justify this statement. So, my dear students, it's my expectation that at the end of our lesson of today, you'll be able to attempt this question. Of course, together some other questions which comes from this topic, but particularly to these two questions which I just gave you. So, while we are going on with the discussion, my dear students, try your best to find the answers to this question. though we are going to talk about it at the end of our lesson of today. My dear students, let's now come to this very important part of development of Cold War. As you can see, development of Cold War. In development of Cold War, we are trying to see when did this Cold War start and when did this Cold War end. This Cold War, it started in 1917, my dear students, as you can see. It started in 1917 with the Russian Revolution, which took place in Russia. And why do we say it 1917? Because one of the things which characterized Cold War, my dear students, it is ideological differences. That there were two competing ideologies. The first ideology was the socialist ideology vis-a-vis the capitalist ideology. So when had these two ideologies emerged? Of course, capitalism ideology has been existing quite for so long, since the 15th century, when it emerged from mercantilism. But here we have the socialist ideology. It was only in book until 1917, during the Russian Revolution, when the first socialist country was established in the world, and that was Soviet Union. So here we come to have socialist ideology represented by Soviet Union, USSR, and the capitalist ideology represented by USA. Of course, all together with some other West European countries, but at that time we have only one nation. My dear students, of course, from there, as we can see, in 1917, when revolution took place in USSR, United States did not recognize USSR until 1937, prior to the outbreak of Second World War. That's when United States recognized USSR. So you can see there was some kind of tension, misunderstanding, and conflict, since 1917. And from there, as you can see, the Cold War started here, and the Cold War was growing little by little. In 1945, the Cold War, came into open. We say it came into open, and that's why, my dear students, some historians, they are tracing the beginning of the Cold War from 1945, during the Potsdam Conference, even though we say no, it's not true. Cold War should be traced from the October Revolution of 1917, because Cold War's root is from the ideological differences, and one ideology emerged here. So in 1945, the Cold War developed at least to a more higher level, and this was during the Potsdam Conference, when the two leaders differed. Remember, during that time, during the Potsdam Conference, there were three leaders who were meeting in the conference. There was Harry Truman of USA. There was Clement Attlee of Britain. Of course, this one came to replace Winston Churchill after Churchill was defeated in the election. And the third was Joseph Stalin of USSR. So you can see, my students, these three leaders were meeting at Potsdam Conference. And remember, they were meeting at Potsdam because they were allies during the Second World War, fighting against the Axis power, of course, made by Germany, Italy, and Japan. So as you can see, during the conference, they differed. They differed because Harry Truman used the atomic bomb without informing, without informing Joseph Stalin of USSR. But there were also some other issues which shall come to discuss about them later in detail. So you can see Cold War here grew from 1917 to 1945. Cold War here grew, as you can see our graph. Cold War increased more in 1947 after President of the United States of America of that time, Harry Truman, issued a doctrine which was called a Truman Doctrine. The doctrine, among other things, it was talking about to contain the spread of communism in the world. To contain the spread of communism in the world. And remember, the Russians at that time, under Joseph Stalin, they wanted to expand communism in the world. So you can see the tension there has to emerge and expand, as in fact tension has to increase. It has to increase because one wants to expand his ideology and the other wants to contain the ideology of the other. So for that case, that increased the Cold War. The situation started to cool down, as you can see our graph. The situation started to cool down. How? Because here there were some incidences which occurred, and one of them was the death of Joseph Stalin, who was replaced by Nikita Khrushchev. And in 1956, Nikita Khrushchev gave a speech which was so welcomed by the Western countries, including United States of America. And that speech was called, it was called a coexistence, that he gave. He spoke about the coexistence. Coexistence, it means the Western countries and the Eastern countries, the socialist countries and the capitalist countries, USSR and USA, they can coexist. They can live together in the same roof, in the same world. That means there is no need for fighting each other, hating each other, and so on. And also in that conference of 1956, which was the International Communist Conference, he also issued a statement to condemn the policies of his predecessor, Joseph Stalin. So his speech was very much welcomed by the Western countries, including United States of America. And as you can see in our graph, the Cold War here somehow was reduced. There was some sort of relaxation of Cold War. And this is what we call the emergence of thaw or detente. But all of suddenly, in 1962, as you can see, the Cold War increased to reach the peak. And why the peak? Because there was what we call the Cuban Missile Crisis. During 1962, on October, the Americans discovered that the Russians have placed the missiles in Cuba. And those missiles could carry the nuclear warhead to attack many American cities. So United States was not happy about that after they discovered the secret underground missile system. Then they wanted those missiles to be removed. And on the other hand, USSR did not want to remove those missiles. Also, Fidel Castro rejected completely the removal of those missiles. So what happened is that the world was very close to go to a nuclear war in 1962. That's why if you look at our graph, my dear students, you'll see the graph here is very high. If you take at percentage, probably it was about 70% or so. You see? The graph is very high. But then, because of what happened here in 1962, there were some changes of the attitude of these two leaders, the leaders of USSR and the leaders of, USA. They changed their attitude, and it was followed immediately in 1963 by what was called, the establishment of direct telephone link between Washington and Moscow. That means the President of the United States of America can just ring from the White House, and the President of Soviet Union can pick the phone in Kremlin. That has in fact cooled the situation, and you can see, if you look at our graph here, you see, situation is becoming somehow improving. So the tension here is very highly reduced, as you can see. But when everybody was believing that Cold War is now coming to an end, all of a sudden, in 1980s, there was re-emergence of Cold War. And probably this is something that my students, most of you are not quite aware of. Because there was a question on this, in fact, and the performance of this question was very bad. And you can see, from 1980, there were some changes of attitude of these, of these two countries, USA and USSR. And what was the consequence? The consequence was the re-emergence of Cold War. And in 1985 in particular, there was the issuing of a doctrine which was called Reagan Doctrine. A Reagan Doctrine. Doctrine which was issued by President Ronald Reagan, and that was a doctrine issued to explain the American foreign policy. It had a lot of things, but most important, relating to our case, it was talking about rolling back of the communist state. And in that book, Ronald Reagan, he refers to the communist state as the evil empire. So you can imagine there was the renewing of Cold War, of course, together with some other things which occurred in 1980s. In 1990, there was the collapse of Soviet Union, and in fact the collapse of Soviet Union, the Eastern Bloc, marked the end of Cold War. However, up to today as we speak, we are still asking ourselves some questions. So at the end, I'm going to give you a question to look whether or not there is a Cold War today as we speak. My dear students, this is the development of Cold War, as you can see about it. My dear students, let's now look, what are the causes of Cold War? Cold War has got so many causes. Let's start with the first cause, which is the Bolshevik Revolution. The Bolshevik Revolution. Of course, we said revolution took place in 1917 after the socialists or the Bolshevik Party led by V.I. Lenin, of course, together with Bukharin, Leon Trotsky, and Joseph Stalin, had successfully overthrown the, the provisional government led by Alexander Kerensky, who earlier overthrown Tsar Nicholas II. And that revolution of 1917, it is considered to be one of the causes. In fact, it's the very important cause for the rise of Cold War in the world. Why? Because we said earlier, this revolution has brought into existence an ideology which is called a socialist ideology. Socialist ideology. And also we said, we said Cold Wars is built upon the basis of ideological differences. Ideological differences. So here we have the socialist and there was the capitalist, which had been already existing in the world. So because of the emergence of these two different ideology, then it marked the beginning of Cold War. My dear students, and this can be proved that the United States of America, the French and the British, they did not accept Soviet Union right day one when it was established. In 1917, after revolution, there was the outbreak of civil war in USSR. And that war, my dear students, was fought between the Red Army, which was the Bolshevik army, vis-a-vis the White Army. The White Army was representing the provisional government which has been overthrown, led by Alexander Kerensky. And the Western countries were supporting the White Army. They were supporting the White Army. In fact, they were discouraged by so many things. But most important is these people became socialists, and so they were opposing. The Red Army because it brought socialism in the world. So it's because of this conflicting ideology that the Cold War started. And much more, my dear students, as you can see, when revolution took place in 1917, United States of America did not recognize USSR until 1937. That means to the USA, USSR did not exist until 1937. So you can imagine. And many people say it's because of the soft policy of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. That's why it was recognized. But otherwise, probably USA could have never recognized USSR. So you can see that's the very important place where we can trace the beginning of the Cold War. My dear students, this is the picture which shows the people of Soviet Union, the Bolsheviks, in fact, celebrating the victories during the October Revolution of 1917. Revolution which, of course, as I said, it changed the world. It changed the world because it led the emergence of Cold War, which later came to divide the world into, in fact, 3 blocks. The Eastern Bloc, Western Bloc, and later the non-aligned countries, my dear students. Let's now go to the second point. The second point is establishment of North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and led by USA in 1949, and the establishment of Warsaw Pact led by USSR. So we have two conflicting blocks. There is NATO vis-a-vis Warsaw Pact. NATO was established in 1949 and the Warsaw Pact in 1955. These two military organizations were established for the purpose of defending the ideologies the ideologies of these countries. For instance, NATO was established by Western countries led by USA to defend the capitalist ideology. And the Warsaw Pact was established in 1955 by USSR to defend the socialist ideology. This one was called NATO, meaning the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, because it included the countries of northern part of Atlantic. That's why they were called North Atlantic Treaty Organization. And Warsaw Pact was called Warsaw because the treaty which established this military organization was signed at Warsaw, which is the capital city of Poland. So that's why, that's the way they came to have these two military organizations, my dear students. So as you can see, this is the two military organizations. So these two military organizations, my dear students, they increase the tension among the nations of the, the nations of Europe, the nations of the world. Why? Because among the terms of this, among the terms which used to establish this military organization is, if one member country is attacked by another country, then all other countries will have to all other countries which belong to that organization will have to go to war to defend their fellow member country. So you can see that the world was put in a very big tension. The world was put in a very big tension for that case. So this is why we speak of NATO and the Warsaw Pact as among the things which contributed much to the increase of tension, misunderstanding, and conflict in the world. My dear students, as you can see, this is the map which shows the members of NATO and the Warsaw Pact. You can see these are the members of NATO. You can see Norway, Denmark, Netherlands, Belgium, West Germany, France, Switzerland, Italy, Portugal. Of course, there is United States and Canada, and so on and so forth. These are the members of NATO, and these are the members of Warsaw Pact. There is Poland, East Germany, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, Yugoslavia, Albania, and USSR, which was in fact the guardian of this military organization called Warsaw Pact, as it is to the Americans in the NATO. So this is the way Europe was divided. This is the way Europe was divided. So that is the NATO and the Warsaw Pact. My dear students, let's now go to another cause, which is the secret development of atomic bomb by USA and Unrest. United States of America has developed an atomic bomb, and this development was done secretly. In fact, the Americans were undertaking the project which was called Manhattan Project, a project which intended to develop atomic bomb which was later used in Japan at Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And that was 1945. It was used in August 1945 at Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The development of that bomb and the use of that bomb has sparked off the beginning of unrest in the world. In fact, very much unfortunately, the bomb was discovered by the Americans, and Joseph Stalin, who was there in the conference, he was not told about the discoveries of that atomic bomb. What Harry Truman said later, it was very shocking, because he told Joseph Stalin that I have discovered a weapon in which the one who owns it is the winners of all war. That was a very, very harsh message to the president of USSR, Joseph Stalin. So it's because of that after bomb was used and this USSR witnessed the damage which was caused by that bomb, then USSR then had only one thing in mind, and that was to struggle at their level best to discover their own bomb, because they knew if they don't, then they are going to be destroyed by the Americans. And that in fact sparked the beginning of unrest, because in 1949 Soviet Union, they came to discover their first nuclear bomb, and later it went on the discoveries of hydrogen bomb, then intercontinental ballistic missiles, and they kept on discovering different kind of weapons, including biological, chemical, weapons and so on. In fact, we are speaking of weapons of mass destruction. We are speaking of WMD, the weapons of mass destruction. So, that is about the secret development of atomic bomb. My dear students, as you can see, this is Hiroshima. This is Hiroshima, and you can see the way Hiroshima was destroyed by the atomic bomb, which was discovered, which was made by United States of America. And this was a very clear message to the Soviets that if this bomb has done such destruction, what, for instance, would have happened if such bomb, if, let's say, the Americans come to drop such bombs, let's say 2 or 3 bombs of that kind, the destruction would have been very, very, very much higher. So for that case, this inspired the Soviets also to do whatever it takes to make sure that they develop the atomic bomb, at least to equal what the what the Americans have done. So that is that's the way you can see it. Let's now look at another cause, and this is the rise of USA as a leading capitalist state and the USSR as a leading socialist state. My dear students, we have 2 countries here. We have USA, a leading capitalist state, and we have USSR, a leading socialist state. These two countries, my dear students, they did not only ended up in being the leading socialist state and the capitalist state. In fact, they also became the guardian of these two political ideology. USA became the guardian of social capitalism, and and USSR became the guardian of that system of socialism. And that increased tension, because whatever happened to capitalism in the world, then USA will have to go and intervene. In fact, they felt that they have an obligation of defending the capitalist system wherever it is in the world. And that is the same to the USSR. Whatever happened to a socialist nation in the world, or socialist system in the world, then USSR felt that they have the moral obligations and of going there and defend the system by using whatever means necessary. So, my dear students, as you can see, it's because of this that increased the tension. The USA, for instance, they even went far and assumed the role of becoming a policeman of the world. That whatever happens in the world, the Americans, they feel that they have got the responsibility of interfering whatever affairs which occurs anywhere in the world. The same applied to Soviet Union and so on and so forth. So, my dear students, it's because of the existing tension between these two countries, then it led to the to the rise and development of Cold War in the world. Remember, my dear students, when we speak of Cold War, we only focus on tension, misunderstanding, conflict, and suspicions among these two leading countries, USA on one hand and USSR on the other hand. There is no physical war. However, war is fought between these countries and the third state. All these countries, they are supporting the war to third world countries. So it can be, it can reveal itself in either civil war, interstate war, or what we call in general the proxy war, as I shall come to see about it in detail later. My dear students, let's now go to another point, my dear students, is the disagreement in the Second World War Conference at Potsdam and Yalta in 1945 over the fate of Germany. There were some disagreement of these people in the in the Potsdam Conference. Potsdam Conference. What had they disagreed? In fact, these countries were allied, and during the conference, as I said earlier, there was President of the United States, Harry Truman, there was President of USSR, Joseph Stalin, and also there was the Prime Minister of Britain, Clement Attlee, who in fact came to replace Winston Churchill after being defeated in the election. So during that conference, there were some misunderstanding. First of all, we said USA used the atomic bomb without informing Soviet Union. So already there were some suspicion among these leaders. But also the other thing is they disagreed about the fate of Germany. What should they do to Germany? Soviet Union, USSR, they took eastern part of Germany. They took eastern part of Germany, East Germany, and they were supposed to withdraw from the areas they have conquered, but they rejected, because the idea was to divide Germany into 4 zones. One zone could be occupied by France, the other zone could be taken by the British, the other zone could be taken by USA, and the rest could go to USSR. So USSR had conquered nearly a half of Germany, but they reject to withdraw from the eastern part they have conquered, and that increased the tension. That caused the conflict among the 3 allies, British, French, and the Americans. But not only that, USSR also rejected to withdraw from the Eastern European countries they have conquered. Instead of withdrawing their forces, they in fact installed the government, and those countries became the communist state, and that also increased the tension. So the post-Second World War Potsdam Conference, it is in fact caused more problems. It provided more problems than the solutions. In fact, that's why some people, of course, we say they wrongly trace the beginning of Cold War from the Potsdam Conference, even though, as I said earlier, we have to trace it from the Russia Revolution of 1917, because the basis of Cold War is ideological differences, as we can see. And that one ideology, which came to conflict with the capitalist ideology, it started in 1917, on October 1st, after the Russian Revolution. My dear students, this is the picture that shows the leaders who were there in the Potsdam Conference. As you can see, this is the British Prime Minister, Clement Attlee. And this is, as you can see, this is Harry Truman of the United States of America, and this is Joseph Stalin. Even when you look at these faces, my dear students, probably except Clement Attlee, he was looking somehow relaxed because he was new by then. Remember, he just came to the conference late to replace Winston Churchill, who was just defeated in the election. But if you look at Harry Truman and Joseph Stalin, you can see the suspicion in their faces. It means they're like two friends sitting together, but in reality, they were not really good of friends. So you can see there were some tensions between them. So Cold War, in fact, one can say was here. Cold War was here in the conference. So that's the way we can explain it. Let's now go to another causes, which is the Russian policy of expansionism vis-a-vis the American policy of expansionism. The Americans were expanding. They were expanding to involve themselves in the European affair. And at the same time, Russia was expanding by increasing the number of her satellite states. So it was USSR vis-a-vis USA, and these countries were expanding by trying to get a lot of countries behind them. USSR, for instance, remember, in 1945, there were only one socialist country, and that was USSR. But as the years moved on, the number of socialist states were increasing, particularly starting with the Eastern European countries, and that has shocked the capitalist country led by USA. But on the other hand, the Americans also were involving so much in the European affairs. They were involving so much in the European affairs, and that went together with the establishment of Nato, for instance, the introduction of Marshall Plan. I shall come to about it later. So all these things led to increase of tension between the Western Bloc and the Eastern Bloc, between USSR and USA. My dear students, as you can see, we already saw this map. We already saw this map. This is the countries which used to belong to Warsaw Pact, and and these are the countries which used to belong to NATO. And of course, we've got some others which were non-aligned country. Of course, at that time, as you can see, there were few in Europe, but there were countries which they neither belonged to the East nor belonged to the West. And those countries were called the non-aligned movement. But you can see the way Europe was divided. This is why we say one of the reasons for the rise and development of Cold War, it was Russia expansionism and the USA influence over Europe. So this caused the tension. This caused a lot of tension. And mind you, my dear students, wherever you see the NATO country, it means here there are some weapons which are ready to attack the East. And if you see the Warsaw Pact also, there are some weapons which are being placed in some military base ready to attack the West. So the situation here was at a very, it was very tense. So that's why we speak of Cold War, because Cold War is all about tension, misunderstanding, and conflict. My dear students, just look. This also reveals the expansionist tendencies of the Soviets. Soviet Union was just, it was just of this size before Second World War. But after Second World War, Soviet Union was able to expand her territory, in fact, to become the biggest country in the world. And also, they were able to establish some other countries in Eastern Europe as their satellite by exporting socialism to these countries. So you can see it was just of this size before Second World War. But after Second World War, they did not only increase the size of their territory, but they were also able to establish another satellite states. The states which could not do anything without the consent of Moscow. So that's the way we can explain it. My dear students, let's now go to another part, which is the manifestation of Cold War. How Cold War is implemented. This is a very important thing, because we are speaking of Cold War, but you have to know how are you going to recognize Cold War, that this is Cold War going on. So we have got a lot of things. This, first of all, intend to give evidence, focusing on events, action, signs that symbolizes the presence of mistrust, tension, conflict, and suspicion, which of course is what we refer to as Cold War. So we are looking at that situation to prove that yes, in the year from 1917 until 1990, there was a Cold War. So we have to give some evidence to prove that there was a Cold War. My dear students, let's first look at the introduction of Iron Curtain. Introduction of Iron Curtain. Introduction of Iron Curtain. What is this Iron Curtain? My dear students, when I speak of Iron Curtain, you might get the idea of a curtain that we know, the one which we put at the window, at the door, and so on. Here we are talking of Iron Curtain, and you start to think it out yourself. If you have put an Iron Curtain, in the window or in the door, can you see outside? The answer is no. You can't see outside. Whether the one from outside cannot see inside. So the one who used this word Iron Curtain, he was referring to mean that there was a total separation between the Eastern people and the Western people. And this word was introduced for the first time, by the former Prime Minister of Britain, Winston Churchill, when he was addressing the students at Westminster College Westminster College in Fulton, Missouri, in United States of America in 1946. He used a word Iron Curtain referring to the separation of capital of the Western people and the Eastern people. And so he said it was very difficult for one to penetrate from the Eastern part to go to the Western part. So there was no social relation, political relation, or economic relation. And if political relation was there, then it was so highly minimized to diplomatic relations only. So there were tension between those people. So that's why we refer to it as Iron Curtain. My dear students, this is the map of Europe which shows the manifestation of that Cold War. This is the Iron Curtain he was referring to. You can see this red line. This red line implies that there was a separation between the Eastern countries and the Western countries. This is Poland, this is Romania, and this is Finland, Sweden, German, Italy, and so on. So this is an Iron Curtain according to Winston Churchill. And the one from the Eastern Party was not allowed to go to the Western Party. And if you go, remember, sometimes you can be arrested. That if you go, for instance, to Moscow and you come back to Britain, you can be arrested that probably you want to harbor communism. The same apply if you are from Moscow. Let's say you go to London and you come back to Moscow, you can also be arrested that you are trying to harbor capitalism. So there was no trusting completely between these people. So this is the way we can understand about the manifestation of Cold War. This is the way we can describe the Cold War. My dear students, another manifestation of Cold War is the establishment of Marshall Plan. Marshall Plan. The Americans came with Marshall Plan in 1947. After they came with Marshall Plan, which intended to help the European economy to recover from the damage of Second World War very quickly, because the USSR feared that maybe that money is going to be used to tempt the Eastern European countries to accept the American Marshall Plan and so turn to become capitalist. Immediately, USSR introduced what was called the Molotov Plan. So you can see, Marshall Plan was introduced by George Marshall, who was the Secretary of the State of the United States of America in 1947, and its implementation was 1948. And Molotov was the Minister of Foreign Affairs of USSR. So he also came with the plan the same year, 1947. And this did not just end there. They came to establish NATO, and this established Warsaw Pact in 1955. But the European countries came with what was called the EEC, European Economic Community. But remember, USSR earlier in 1949, they established what was called the COMECON. COMECON means COMECON means the Council for Mutual Economic Assistance. It was established intending to help the Eastern European countries economically, as the Americans were using Marshall Plan, and the European established of course it started as iron and coal associations between the French and the Germans, the two traditional enemies, in 1952, before expanding to become European Economic Community, and now it is European Union, as we can speak of. So this also has caused a lot of tension, my dear students. Let's now go to another point to show manifestation of Cold War, and this is the Berlin Blockade in June 1948. The Soviet Union troops blocked all the railroad highways, and the water traffic through the Eastern German to go to the West Berlin. that they blocked anybody to go to the West Berlin, which was under the Western countries. And you can see, my dear students, this is the way we can describe the blockade. This is the Berlin, the city of Berlin, and this is the western part of Berlin, and it was under the Western countries. The British, the French, and the British, the French, and the Americans. So they blocked. There was no no one was allowed to bring food to this area or any supply. So the Americans and the others, they have to bring food to this area and other supplies by dropping them from the air. And it was called the Berlin airlifting. And in fact, that lasted for 11 months. You can imagine, for 11 months they were getting food dropped from the air. This also shows to what extent there was tension. Because if it was in this supply, probably people who live here would die. So that shows how Cold War was implemented. The tension, misunderstanding, and the conflict. Another point here, before we go to that, my dear students, you can see this is the plane which was dropping food from the, from above, and these are the people of that section, western section of Berlin, waiting for the supply of food from the United States, Britain, and France. So this is the plane dropping food, and these are the people who are waiting for food. So you can imagine the tension of that extent. This really implies that there was a Cold War. There was really a Cold War. My dear students, let's now go to another point, and that is the arms race and escalation of weapons of mass destruction. We are speaking about arms race. Arms race means the competition or production of weapons. And my dear students, we are not just speaking of small weapons. We are speaking of weapons of mass destruction. We are talking about the large weapons like, atomic bombs, nuclear bombs, hydrogen bombs. We are talking of intercontinental ballistic missile, ICBM. We are talking of others like this can be of short range, medium range, and long range. All these are the weapons of mass destruction. So these countries were competing in production of weapons of mass destruction. But away the arms race, it means it is a peacetime competition for production of weapons. And here they are producing a weapon of mass destruction. But it just not end there. It also goes with the escalations of those weapons. Away the escalations means the spread of those weapons, because they have their military bases and they want to put their weapons in their military bases so that they can have a near target in case there is the outbreak of war. And that was increasing tension in the world. And of course, the aftermath of that, it is the suffering of the people. My dear students, as you can see, these are the countries which today, as we speak, of course, they possess nuclear weapons. And, the production of nuclear weapons started in 1945 with the USA, only producing 2 bombs. One was produced by using uranium, and other by using plutonium. And those 2 bombs were used at Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And USSR in 1949, they produced their first nuclear bomb, and that nuclear bomb has never been used. But today, as we speak, USSR has got 6,850 nuclear bombs. USA has 6,550 nuclear bombs. Here we have got some other countries. This is France, has got 300. You see, Britain 215. Israel has got 80. Pakistan 145. India, the 2 traditional enemies, also they have the weapon 135. China 208. So Korea, North Korea 15. So this is what we mean by escalations of those weapons of mass destruction. Much of it was contributed by Cold War. Tension, misunderstanding, and conflict. Of course, we are going to see this in detail in the next subtopic when we talk about the nuclear arms race. You'll see that why do countries develop nuclear weapons? My dear students, another manifestation of Cold War is the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962. There was Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962 that in October, United States, they came to discover that there is some underground missile system which have been placed by by USSR, and those missiles had the ability of attacking any American cities, and in fact they could carry the nuclear warhead, and that increased tension. This of course is going to be looked more in the next subtopic, but this is this is Cuba, and the American spy plane U-2 discovered the underground missile systems which have been placed in this area, and in fact they wanted these missiles to be removed, but unfortunately Soviet Union rejected to remove those missiles, and it caused the increase of tension, and so on and so forth. Another manifestation of Cold War is the outbreak of proxy war involving the two superpowers, either direct or indirect. As I said earlier, we have got this proxy war. These two countries, USA and USSR, as we have said, and under the situation of Cold War, they always never fight against each other. But what happened is there are some wars which occurred either between them, these countries, and other countries, or between some other countries supported by these two countries. This is what we mean by the proxy war. My dear students, this is the example of the proxy war which have been fought in the world. For instance, here we have the conflict in the Middle East. Since 1967, 1980s, we have got also war in Afghanistan between Soviet Union and the Afghan guerrillas. We have got the Korean War, USA and the North Korea. We have got Cuban Missile Crisis. We have got war in Central America. For instance, there is war in Chile, for instance. There was also war in Nicaragua and so on. This is showing the example of the proxy war, and this is one of the things which can be identified as the manifestation of Cold War. Another thing is the establishment of military bases. Military bases were established in different parts of the world, and the reason why these countries develop military base is due to the fact that they want to have a near target in case there is a war, because they believe that it will be better for them if you attack your enemy and finish your enemy in just that first attack, and not be able to launch a retaliation attack. So the best you can do for that case is to have the military bases established very close to your enemy. So that's why the United States of America has established a lot of military bases in Europe, in Turkey, in Greece, in Italy, and so on and so forth. On the other hand, USSR, that's why in 1962 they tried to establish a military base in Cuba, at least to have a very near target if a war broke out between USA and USSR. Another point is the Truman Doctrine of 1947. As I said earlier, this doctrine has intended at containing the spread of communism. And remember at that time, Joseph Stalin, on the other hand, was also thinking of expanding socialism. So you have got two you have got two policies here, in contradictions. The first is Truman, who wanted to contain the spread of communism, but on the other hand, we have Joseph Stalin, who wanted to expand or to export socialism to other countries. So these people, came into a very big tension. This led to the increasing tension, misunderstanding, and the conflict in Europe and in the world, at large. So this, as you can see, shows the implementation of that Truman Doctrine, where Truman in 1948 he asked about 1947, sorry, he asked about 40 million US dollar to aid Greece and Turkey. Why Greece and Turkey? It was in 1947 that there was the danger of Greece and Turkey becoming communist. Already there were some communist movement in these countries, and the USSR had already started to fund some of the socialist movements to take over Turkey and Greece. So the Americans quickly agreed to provide $400 million to help Greece and Turkey so that they don't turn communist. So you can see this is just the example of the Truman Doctrine. And by giving this money to Turkey and Greece, it's obvious that USSR under Joseph Stalin at that time was not happy. They were also trying a way to make sure that they export socialism by using whatever means they can. So that is another manifestation of Cold War. Another manifestation of Cold War is the Berlin War. In 1961, USSR built a wall to separate the East Berlin and West Berlin. He wanted to he wanted to prevent people who were trying to cross from the eastern section of Berlin to go to the western section of Berlin. In fact, they were running away because in the eastern party there were shortage of supplies and so on. And in order to make sure that people are not crossing to go to the other side, USSR decided to build a wall which was called the Berlin Wall. That is also one of the signs to show that there was a Cold War. This is the Berlin Wall, as you can see, very thick wall, and this is the soldier who was guiding the wall, and this is the guarding post, as you can see at the top. So this implies that there was really a Cold War at that time. My dear students, after we have finished, let's now break for a while. We'll be back for the... My dear students, let's just break for a while. We'll be back to look the questions which I gave you earlier. Welcome back, my dear students. Now we have the questions. Remember, at the beginning of our lesson of today, I just gave you two questions. The first question which I gave you was analyze the key issues which escalated the tension between the Eastern Bloc and Western Bloc up to 1980s. My dear students, as you can see, the issues escalated the tension between the Eastern Bloc and Western Bloc in 1980s. The issue escalated the tension here is what we refer to the emergence of Cold War, because Cold War, we said, is nothing but tension, misunderstanding, and conflict. As you can see, this is tension. So, my dear students, the question therefore is becoming very, very simple. Very simple because now you have the answers. The key issues which escalated tension between Eastern Bloc and Western Bloc up to 1980s means that you'll have to give factors for the rise of Cold War, which I know you have them all. That is the first question. The second question, it was easy to reveal the existence of Cold War between Eastern Bloc and Western Bloc. Just by this statement, how can you reveal that there was a Cold War? I said earlier that somebody can come and ask you a very challenging question that there was no Cold War. You're just bluffing. You're just, it's just an imagination. There was no Cold War. So how are you going to prove, my students, that there was a Cold War? This is what the question wants, that it was easy to reveal. It was very simple to reveal, to show that there was a Cold War. And, why do we say it was simple? Because you have already the manifestation of Cold War. So you're going to use those points, my dear students, to attempt this question, that there was a Cold War because of, let's say, the existence of Berlin Wall, the existence of this, the existence of military base, and so on and so forth. That is very easy to answer this question for that case. My dear students, let's now come to the end of our lesson of today, and it's my hope that you have enjoyed the lesson, and also you have also covered well these questions, and you can attempt not only this question but also other questions which might come from this topic. My dear students, let's meet next time, and we'll proceed with our second subtopic, which is the Unrest and Cuban Missile Crisis. Thank you very much and goodbye.
Wizara ya Elimu, Sayansi na Teknolojia pamoja na Ofisi ya Rais TAMISEMI na kupitia Baraza la Mitihani Tanzania NECTA kwa kushirikiana na Shirika la Utangazaji Tanzania TBC na Chama cha Walimu Tanzania CWT pamoja na mawakala wa vyuo vikuu nje ya nchi Global Education Link wanakuletea kipindi cha Darasa Online.